Om Sarashavasamaramabham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmaracharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Good. Be seated, please. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavai Tejasvinavadhi Tamastu Ma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Good. Welcome to you all, and welcome to our viewers watching online, our students. We come today to the final part of Chapter 8, and we'll begin with some recitation, beginning with verse 23. As always, as I'm chanting, read the translation, and then repeat after me. Yatra kale tvanavritam, yatra kale tvanavritam, avritam chaiva yoginaha, avritam yaiva yoginaha, prayata yogitam kalam, prayata yatitam yolam, vakshyami bharatarshabha, Vakshyami bharatarshabha, Agnirjyotiraha shuklaha, Agnirjyotiraha shuklaha, Shanmasahutarayanam, Shanmasahutarayanam, Yatra prayata gachanti, Tatra prayata gachanti, Brahma Brahma vido janaha, Brahma Brahma vido janaha, Dhumo ratristata Krishnaha, Dhumo ratristata Shanmasa dakshinayanam, Shanmasa dakshinayanam, Yat-tatra chandramasam jyotir, Tatra chandramasam jyotir, Yogi prapya nivartate, Yogi prapya nivartate, Shukla Krishne gati hyete, Shukla Krishne gati hyete, Jagata shashvate mate, Jagata shashvate mate, Ekaya yatyana vrittam, Ekaya yatyana vrittam, Anaya vartate punaha, Anaya vartate punaha, Naite sriti partha janan, Naite sriti partha janan, Yogi muhyati kaschana, Yogi muhyati kaschana, Tasmat sarveshu kaleshu, Tasmat sarveshu kaleshu, Yoga yukto bhavarjuna, Yoga yukto bhavarjuna. The longer meter comes here. Vedeshu yajneshu tapassu chaiva, Vedeshu yajneshu tapassu chaiva, Daneshu yat punya phalam pradishtam. Daneshu yat punya phalam pradishtam. Atyeti yat sarvamidam viditva. Yogi param sthanam upaiti chadyam. Yogi param sthanam upaiti chadyam. Very good. So, yes. Before we begin, at the end of last week's class, I apparently misspoke several times at the end, using the word akshara for Brahma, using the word akshara instead of avyakta. Avyakta, unmanifest, akshara, undecaying. Akshara refers to Brahman. Avyakta refers to the world in an unmanifest condition. So if you got confused at the end of the class, I apologize for that. You can go back and watch it again if you need to and remove your confusion. We come now to the last portion of Chapter 8, which is a little obscure, so it needs a proper introduction. The whole of the chapter, of course, was prompted by Arjuna's question. In particular, his last question, where he asked Sri Krishna, how does one reach you at the end of their lives? Through meditation. And Sri Krishna gave two methods of reaching him at the end of life. By the way, when he said reaching me, he meant reaching Brahman. He spoke of himself as that highest goal. So to reach Krishna means to gain enlightenment, to merge, so to speak, into Brahman. So he gave two methods. One is to spend your life in sadhana and become enlightened, because the enlightened at death reach Sri Krishna. The other option he gave, we talked about at some length, was a very, very profound meditation practice, which was intended to be practiced in your dying moments. As you die, if you are able to perform this particular meditation practice, Sri Krishna says, in that way also you can reach me. Now, in this last section, we actually see a third method of reaching Sri Krishna at the end of one's life, reaching Brahman, I should say, at the end of one's life. And because it's a little obscure, I went and double-checked with Madhusudana Saraswati's commentary, and he makes it very clear what this last section is about. He described that, let me introduce the term. He described as the third option, he uses a term used frequently in Advaita Vedanta called Krama Mukti. Krama means step. Krama Mukti is gradual liberation. And this is contrasted with other terms you already know, Jivan Mukti, to be enlightened during your life. You already know the term Videha Mukti, to be enlightened without a body, means after your life is over. So in addition to Jivan Mukti and Videha Mukti, here we find a third kind of mukti. Mukti means liberation. The third kind here is called Krama Mukti, gradual liberation. And that term sounds odd because it's found mostly outside of traditional Advaita Vedanta. It's found in I think it's found in Chandogya Upanishad, but mostly it's found in Puranas. And it's presented, let me describe what it is. It is said that if you have accumulated a tremendous amount of punya karma in this life, if you've been very pious in this life, and especially if you've done a tremendous amount of spiritual practice in this life, it is said that at your death, you can reach the highest of the heavens. They describe in the Puranas 7 heavens, the highest of which is called Brahmaloka. So if you are exceedingly pious and have done sufficient sadhana, spiritual practice in this life, at death you can reach Brahmaloka, and you remain in Brahmaloka for the extent of the current kalpa, the current cycle of creation. When the current cycle of creation goes away, the entire universe goes into dissolution, along with the 7 heavens and 7 hells. So Brahmaloka goes into dissolution. Brahmaji is in that loka, so Brahmaji himself goes into dissolution. What happens to you at the time of dissolution is you merge into Brahman. This is what's taught as Krama Mukti, mostly in Puranas, a little bit in Vedanta. So it says that if you are exceedingly pious and you do sufficient spiritual practice, you reach Brahmaloka at the end of this life. You remain there until the end of the cycle of creation, and then you merge into Brahman. And you can see why it's called Krama Mukti, because there are some intermediate steps and some delay in that process of mukti. Now, in the view of traditional Advaita Vedanta, that's a little problematic because Shankara says again and again, all the great acharyas say that, jnanam eva mokshaha, their common term. Moksha, liberation, enlightenment is jnanam eva, it's knowledge alone. This doesn't sound like there's any knowledge involved, so Vedantins very cleverly reconcile this. It's kind of almost cute. They say that when you go to Brahmaloka, Brahmaji himself gives you discourses on Advaita Vedanta. and from Brahmaji, you gain this jnanam, and therefore you are enlightened while you're in Brahmaloka. So this is a Vedantic way of reconciling this teaching of Krama Mukti, which is not really part of traditional Advaita Vedanta, but Advaita Vedanta, since it's part of the tradition, Advaita Vedanta accepts it and reconciles it. And Krama Mukti is our last topic. So let's see how Sri Krishna teaches Krama Mukti. Yatra kale tvanavrittam, yatra kale tvanavrittam, avrittam chaiva yoginaha, avrittam chaiva yoginaha, prayata yanti tam kalam, prayata yanti kalam, vakshyami bharatarshabha, vakshyami bharatarshabha. Start in the second line, and yoginaha is plural for yogi. And what about those yogis in the third line? Prayataha, they're dying. So those yogis who at the time of death, yanti, they travel. When do they travel? And this is Sri Krishna's topic. When they travel, up at the top now, yatra kale, at which time they travel. What do you mean, at which time they travel? Sri Krishna defines here 2 in particular. There is a time at which anavrittam, a time at which they don't return, dying at a particular time, they don't return, avrittam chaiva, and there's a time at which they return. If you die at a certain time, you might know the terms Uttarayana, Dakshinayana. We're going to describe them in detail in the next 2 verses, Sri Krishna. So if you die during Uttarayana, that time of year, it is said that you don't return anavritam. And if you die during Dakshinayana, we'll define these terms in just a moment. If you die during that period of the year, then avritim. Then you return. All of that's going to be explained. So, in fact, Sri Krishna himself says, tam kalam, about that time at which you die, the time when you return, the time which you don't die, about that time, vakshyami, I will tell you. So that's the next topic. I will tell you, Bharatarshava, Rishabha is bull. O bull of Bharata, O descendant of Bharata, mighty descendant of the ancient king Bharata. I will tell you that. And here is now Sri Krishna's description of those two times, and I'll make the connection to Krama Mukti in just a few moments. Agnir Jyotiraha Shuklaha Agnir Jyotiraha Shuklaha Shanmasahutarayanam Shanmasahutarayanam Tatra Prayata Gachanti Tatra Prayata Gachanti Brahma Brahma Vido Janaha Brahma Brahma Vido Janaha. Good. So here he's defining Shanmasa in the second line, Uttarayanam. He's defining one of those two times as being Uttarayana, the northern path. And some terms I think we need to explain. Let me go to the board. It'll be much easier for me to explain some of this nomenclature. So this term, Uttara plus Ayana, Ayanam here means path. It would be nice if I could spell. Ayana means path. Uttarayana means the northern path of the sun. I know nothing about astronomy and astrology, but it's the time when the sun is in the northern hemisphere. And don't ask me what the details what that means, but it does mean the time that follows summer solstice. I think follows winter solstice, December 21st, and up to summer solstice, June 21. So I think from December 21, and these dates vary a little bit, up to summer solstice. What am I doing here? Boy, I'm really spacing out here. That's interesting. I'm sorry. There we go. Yeah, 12/21. Yeah, that's fine. 12/20 to 6/21. From December 21st to June 21st. And I think I've confused myself writing like that. Okay, sorry. Okay, so this Uttarayana, the term used in most scriptures, Uttarayana is kind of like a technical astrological term. So the more general term is Devayana. Devayana means the yana, the path of the devas, the path of the gods. So if you die during the Uttarayana, during the period of the year when the sun is in the northern hemisphere, then you travel after death the Uttarayana, the northern path, which is the Devayana, the path of the gods. And by traveling that Devayana, the path of the gods, you reach Brahmaloka. Now, this is where we're going to get the connection now to Krama Mukti. So if you make it to Brahmaloka by taking this Devayana, then you can gain Krama Mukti. On the other hand, if you happen to die during Dakshina Ayana, Dakshina means south. So if you die during the Dakshina Ayana, which is called, the scriptural name for this is Pitra Pitrayana, the path of the Pitras. Pitra means ancestor. So as opposed to the Devayana, the path of the gods, you might travel the Pitrayana, the path of the ancestors. You travel by means of this Dakshina Ayana, the southern path, and traveling that southern path, you reach heaven, but a heaven from which you return. Both lead to heaven. Both Uttarayana and Dakshinayana lead to heaven. But Pitrayana leads you to one of the conventional heavens, and we've discussed before, you make it to heaven based on the accumulated merit, accumulated good karmas, but while you are in that heavenly domain, you exhaust your accumulated punya karmas. When those accumulated punya karmas are over, your life in heaven comes to an end. So the heavens you reach by means of Pitrayana, those heavenly lifetimes are limited in scope, and there is avritti, return, after living in those heavenly realms, as opposed to those who travel by means of Devayana, the path of the gods, which specifically leads to Brahmaloka. Having reached Brahmaloka, there is avritti, there is no return, because at the end of the kalpa, you become enlightened, you merge into Brahman. Okay, now we've got our terminology down. And so these Shanmasa, those 6 months of Uttarayanam, the period of time when the sun is in the northern hemisphere, those 6 months are characterized by, in the first line, characterized by Agni, the path of fire, characterized by Jyotihi, the path of light, characterized as a path of Aha, day, and characterized as a path of Shuklaha. Shukla is another astronomical term here for the period of waxing moon. It can also mean white and other things. Here it means the period of the waxing moon. So those terms are used to describe this Uttarayana. What about it? In the third line, Tatra, there, Gachan prayataha gachanti. Those yogis who prayataha, who travel that Uttarayana, gachanti, they reach what? Fourth line, Brahma. They reach Brahman, they reach Brahmaloka. And having reached Brahmaloka, then they remain in Brahmaloka till the end of the kalpa, then they merge into Brahman. And here we see that Vedantic reconciliation. It says here, those janaha, those people, those yogis who are brahmavidaha, who are brahmavit, those who know Brahman. So they know Brahman, there are several ways of putting it. They know Brahman because, as I joked with you, Brahmaji himself gives you a nice lecture on Advaita Vedanta while you're in Brahmaloka. Or Madhusudana Saraswati in his commentary gives a different interpretation of that equally valid interpretation. Let me remind you, there's no one right interpretation. A right interpretation is anything that's consistent with the entire scripture and the entire tradition. Notice that's a very high bar to qualify as a correct interpretation. Has to be consistent not just with the verse, but with the entire scripture, the entire Bhagavad Gita in this case. Also, it has to be consistent with the entire tradition, not just the Bhagavad Gita, but the entire body of scriptures. But as high as that bar for correct interpretation is, it's possible for there to be multiple correct interpretations. One correct interpretation is they're enlightened. They could be enlightened before birth. Actually, they can't be enlightened before birth. Can you guess why? I actually corrected myself. They cannot I said first of all, I said before birth, I misspoke. Could it mean that these janaha, these yogis who die, are enlightened at the time of death? Is that a correct interpretation? I'm being a little fussy with you right now, but you'll see why. Bear in mind, if these yogis are enlightened at the time of death, they don't travel anywhere. They don't go by Dakshinayana, they don't go by Uttarayana, they immediately merge into Brahman. So that interpretation would be wrong to suggest that these yogis are Brahmavidaha, they are enlightened at the time of death. That would be an incorrect interpretation. One correct interpretation is Brahmaji teaches them in Brahmaloka. They become enlightened there, and thereby they merge into Brahman. The other interpretation given by Madhusudana in his commentary is this Brahmavit can be interpreted as this. There's a convention of knowledge referring to upasana meditation. So this is a big thing in some commentaries. It's based on some Upanishads. But based on this tradition, Madhusudana interprets Brahmavit as those who meditate on Saguna Brahman. Those are his words. His exact words, but not in English. His exact words, those who meditate on Saguna Brahman. So, and that meditating on Saguna Brahman is that part of that life of piety and intense spiritual practice, leading the person to, on this Uttarayana, leading them to Brahmaloka and enlightenment. So, notice interpretations, we have to be careful. Notice I suggested one very casually that was wrong. They cannot be enlightened at the time of death, because then they won't travel any path, Dakshinayana or Uttarayana. Next verse. Dhumo ratristata Krishnaha, Dhumo ratristata Krishnaha, Shanmasa Dakshinayanam, Shanmasa Dakshinayanam, Tatra Chandramasam Jyotir, Tatra Chandramasam Jyotir, Yogi Prapya Nivartate, Yogi Prapya Nivartate. Good. So here in the second line, you see Dakshinayanam. As we saw at the board, Dakshinayanam is the Pitrayana, the path of the ancestors, and it's the result of dying after the summer solstice of June 21st and prior to the winter solstice of December 21st. So if you die at that time, now it's just not mechanically a matter of the time of death, but it's also, remember, these are two paths to heaven. Do you think, sorry to use a modern political example, do you think this Russia's Putin, at the time of his death, is going to go to heaven by either one of these paths? Not very likely, given the horrible destruction and war crimes that are taking place today in Ukraine. So these two paths are not followed by anyone and everyone. These are two paths to heaven, followed only by those who are qualified to go to heaven, based on the karmas you have done in this life and prior lives. So those who are ready for heaven and die during Uttarayana, they can go to Brahmaloka. Those who are qualified to reach heaven, but they don't die during Uttarayana, they die during Dakshinayana. They travel by that path, the Pitrayana, the path of the ancestors, and they reach a heaven from which they get reborn. They don't make it the Brahmaloka, the highest of the heaven. They reach another heavenly domain, and they get reborn from that. Sri Krishna will explain in the second half. Let's finish the first half. This Shanmasa, these 6 months, which are Dakshinayana, the time during which the sun is in the southern hemisphere, that period of time is characterized by dhuma, smoke, ratri, night, and Krishna. Here, Krishna means dark, referring to the waning period of the moon, when the moon is waning. So this Dakshinayana, what about it? Tat in the second half, tatra, there, last line, yogi prapya. A yogi, having died prapya, having died at that period of time, that yogi prapya attains chandramasam jyoti, the light of the moon, the so-called lunar path. The Uttarayana is called the solar path, and Dakshinayana is called the lunar path. How many names to describe these two? So those yogis, yogi prapya, a yogi dying at that time during the Dakshinayana, and that yogi prapya attains the chandramasam jyoti, the light of the moon, literally, which means the lunar path, and he reaches heaven, that yogi reaches heaven, and significantly, the last line, nivartante, returns. So one who travels to Brahmaloka by means of the Devayana, there is no return, no avriti. But for one who reaches the other heavens, the other heavenly realms, by means of this Dakshinayana, this Pitrayana, the path of the ancestors, they reach heaven, they enjoy a lifetime in heaven, but they, nivartante, there is avriti, there is return for them. Okay, then. Sri Krishna summarizes here. Shukla Krishne gati hyete, Shukla Krishne gati hyete, Jagata shashvate mate, Jagata shashvate mate, Ekaya yatyana vrittam, Ekaya yatyana vrittam, Anyaya vartate punaha, Anyaya vartate punaha. Shukla Krishne gati hi ete, he, indeed, ete, these two. Sanskrit is famous for having a special numerical treatment of the two. There's not only singular and plural, there is a dual number in Sanskrit. These words are in a dual number. Ete, these two. These two what? Gati, these two paths. What are these two paths? The Shukla Gati, the bright path, the path of the sun, and Krishna Gati, the dark path, the path of the moon. So using these two terms to describe the Uttarayana and Dakshinayana, the Devayana, path of the gods, and Pitrayana, path of the ancestors. These, Jagataha, in the world, Shashvate Mate. These are Mate, considered to be Shashvata, eternal. These paths are considered to be eternal, which means they're considered to be part of the scriptural body and therefore accorded with respect and acceptance as a matter of belief. All of this is a matter of belief. We have no way of confirming. You can't go for a nice Saturday drive by Devayana or Pitrayana. You won't find any road signs like that. I'm being silly, but the point is you have no way of experientially confirming any of this. So we rely on the Shastra, on the scriptures, and the scriptures which have proven to be reliable when they describe moksha. Moksha you can personally verify. This is an interesting argument for scriptural authority. The argument goes like this. How do you know that a scripture is authoritative? Now, the conventional way is, the ancient rishis said it, it must be true. It's an argument, but it's not a terribly strong argument. Here's a much stronger argument. Enlightenment, moksha, can be personally confirmed by you in your experience in this lifetime. Scriptures teach moksha. Moksha you can personally confirm to be true. So the same scriptures that teach moksha, which you can personally confirm to be true, those same scriptures also teach us Pitrayana and Devayana. So in this way, if moksha is true, then Pitrayana and Devayana, even though you can't personally demonstrate them to be true, you can give the Shastra benefit of doubt, so to speak. This is a basis for scriptural authority. Okay. Ekaya, in the second half, by one of these two paths, yati, a person travels, and anavritim, there is no return. Avriti, return, avriti. There is no return if you travel by means of the Devayana during the Uttarayana, Ekaya, by that path, yati, one goes, and anavritim, there is no return. On the other hand, anyaya, going by the other path, the Pitrayana, the Dakshinayana, going by the other path, there is punaha, once again, avartate, one returns. You live and enjoy your life in that heavenly domain. When your punya karma is exhausted, you get reborn. Then, naite sriti partha janan, naite sriti partha janan, yogi muhyati kaschana, yogi muhyati kaschana, tasmat sarveshu kaleshu, tasmat sarveshu kaleshu, yoga yukto bhavarjuna, yoga yukto bhavarjuna. See the na at the first line, na ete. Take that na into the second line. Na kaschana yogi. No possible yogi, no yogi whatsoever, none of the yogis. And here yogi is used in the term yogi will depend on the context, right? So the context in chapter 6, a yogi is a meditator. A yogi in chapter 12 would be a bhakta. A yogi in chapter 3 would be a karma yogi. So which yogi are we talking about here? Could be a meditator, since this chapter opened with Arjuna asking, how do I reach you through meditation? Or it could be taken either as a meditator or as a spiritual practitioner in general. Either way, that yogi, nakashana yogi, no such yogi, muhyati, gets confused. Gets confused about what in the first line? Ete. Break apart the na, then you have ete. No yogi gets confused about ete, these two, sriti, these two paths, janan, knowing these two paths. No yogi who understands these two paths gets confused. Partha, O Arjuna, son of Kunti, tasmat, therefore. It's pretty much concluding the chapter. There's one more verse, but this tasmat kind of concludes this final topic. Tasmat, therefore, Arjuna, sarveshu kaleshu, at all times, yoga yuktaha bhava. O Arjuna, bhava, you should be yoga yuktaha, engaged in yoga. You should be engaged in yoga. Yoga here means spiritual practice of all kinds. You should be engaged in spiritual practice when? Sarveshu kaleshu. Even though this chapter is focused on the end of your life, we've had this discussion in prior classes, the chapter is focusing on end of life, but spiritual practice is not for the end of your life. Well, I'm preparing a video on Bhartrahari's Vairagya Shatakam. This 100 verses on Vairagya. And in one poem, he has this hilarious comment. A comment about those who wait until the end of their lives to undertake spiritual practice. And to Bhartrahari, waiting till the end of your life when your body is falling apart, your mind is dull, you're getting ready to die. So he says, waiting to the end of your life for the sake of picking up spiritual practice, he says, it's like waiting until your house is on fire to dig a well. When your house is on fire, it's too late to dig a well. And when you're old and decrepit, it's too late to take up intense spiritual practice. That's his point. Just really nice poetry. So spiritual practice is meant for your lifetime, sarveshu kaleshu, at all times. You should be engaged in your spiritual practice. In this way, you can reach Sri Krishna at the end of life in one of three ways. We've got 3 ways described in this chapter, right? One way is your life of sadhana leads to enlightenment. And you gain jivan mukti, enlightenment while alive. Or, in his last section, he said, if you live a life of spiritual practice, accumulate lots of good karma, and do lots of sadhana, but don't manage to make it into enlightenment, you're not quite enlightened in this lifetime, then what? And if you die during Uttarayana, then you go by this Devayana, and you go and you reach Brahmaloka and you become enlightened. I forgot to mention before, there's a famous story most of you know in the Mahabharata, from which the Bhagavad Gita is drawn, a story in which Bhishma, who has been fatally wounded, he waits. He's pierced through by hundreds of arrows, but he has been given by his father the power of Ichcha Mrityu. He can choose the moment of his death. And what does he do? He waits. He delays his death until Uttarayana. Why does he delay his death until Uttarayana? So he can reach Brahmaloka and gain Krama Mukti. So a life of sadhana can make you enlightened in this life. You have jivan mukti. Or if you live a life of sadhana, fail to get enlightened in this life, you can still reach Brahmaloka and gain Krama Mukti. And then the third option, what was the third option we saw earlier in this chapter? You can live a life of sadhana to prepare you for your death. And at the time of your death, you can practice these intense meditation practices that Sri Krishna described. And by meditating in this manner at the time of your death, at the moment of your death, you can gain enlightenment at the very end of your life. Okay, this chapter concludes with a verse in praise of those yogis. And here yogi means spiritual practitioner any spiritual practice. We described in the at the end of the last class, I made mention of the fact that it's not that spiritual practice is bhakti or jnana or karma yoga or meditation. It's all of that. So here, a yogi is described as a spiritual practitioner, one who practices all of those sadhanas. And about that yogi, he describes in that longer meter. That longer meter is used to call your attention to very special verses. This is a verse of praise, so it's in a longer meter. Vedeshu yajneshu tapassu chaiva Vedeshu yajneshu tapassu chaiva Daneshu yat punya phalam pradishtam Daneshu yat punya phalam pradishtam Atyeti tat sarvamidam viditva Atyeti tat sarvamidam viditva Yogi param sthanam upaiti chadyam Yogi param sthanam upaiti chadyam. Very good. Starting the last line, we'll go backwards. Yogi, so spiritual practitioner. Third line, yogi viditva, having understood, having known, tat sarvam idam, having known all this. Sarvam idam, all this. All this what? All this that Sri Krishna has been teaching, and not just in chapter 8, but from chapter 1, actually chapter 2 onwards. He doesn't teach in chapter 1. So all that Sri Krishna has taught from chapter 2 onwards, a yogi who understands tat sarvam, all of that Sri Krishna has taught. What about that yogi? That yogi in third line beginning, atyeti. That yogi transcends, goes beyond. Goes beyond what? End of the second line. That yogi goes beyond punya phalam. That yogi transcends punya phalam, the results of good karmas. That yogi transcends the good karmas which are pradishtam, which have been taught. Good karmas which have been taught where? First line, Vedeshu, in the Vedas. Let me just summarize that. That yogi, sarvam idam viditva, understanding all that Sri Krishna has taught in the Bhagavad Gita, that yogi atyeti transcends the punya phalam, the results of good deeds. In particular, he says that which is pradishtam vedeshu, that which is taught in the Vedas. Mostly what is taught in the Vedas is ritual. We don't study those portions of the Vedas, but you should understand that the bulk of the Vedic rituals are dedicated to the performance of rituals. And we recognize the importance of performing rituals as blessing you with God's grace, but we also recognize the limitations of those rituals. And Sri Krishna here is calling your attention to the limitations of performing Vedic rituals. That's quite significant. Sri Krishna himself criticizes a narrow focus on the performance of Vedic ritual. That's a correct statement based on what we've just said here. Sri Krishna himself is critical of those who would very narrowly focus their spiritual practice only on the performance of Vedic rituals. So this yogi, atyeti, transcends punya phalam pradishtam, all of the rituals which are taught, Vedeshu, which are taught in the Vedas, rituals which are taught with regard to yajneshu, with regard to yajna, the fire rituals, things which are taught in the Vedas with regard to tapas, spiritual austerities, Ch.8 daneshu, and practices concerning charity. So all acts of yajna, ritual, tapas, austerity, and dana, charity, all of these acts, karmas, deeds, as described, upadishtam, as described in the Vedas, this yogi atyeti transcends all of them. How? Sarvamidam viditva, understanding all that Sri Krishna has taught from chapter 2 onwards, and in the last line, that yogi sthanam upayati, that yogi reaches what? Param sthanam, the ultimate status. Sthanam, place. The ultimate place, referring to Brahman. He says, Cha adyam at the end. Cha adyam, adyam, primordial, for that which happens first, referring to that which is eternal, unborn, uncreated. We used in the last class akshara, undecaying, for that term, for that Brahman. So that yogi, understanding all that Sri Krishna has taught in this chapter and the preceding chapter, that yogi transcends all that can be attained through Vedic rituals, through austerities, and through charity, through good deeds. That yogi reaches Brahman, in a word. And with that verse, chapter 8 comes to an end. We've taken this opportunity at the end of each chapter to recite this English verses I composed long ago. English verses, as you remember, they follow the meter of the original, so we can chant them in the same way as we chant the Sanskrit verses. They're also condensed, abbreviated, so that by chanting these English verses, we can get a nice overview or summary of the Bhagavad Gita. We'll do that right now. First, you can listen and repeat so that you can recall the meter, the mode of chanting, and then the remaining verses we'll recite together. Repeat after me. Arjuna said, what is Brahman and what is self? What is Brahman and what is self? What is karma? Creation too. What is karma? Creation too. At death when souls continue on. At death when souls continue on. How are you to be realized? How are you to be realized? You can chant together now. Join me. The Blessed Lord said, Brahman, his true reality, your own real nature is the self, karma is the cause for rebirth, creation is all finite things. When souls leave their bodies at death, with their minds fixed on me alone, they all reach my supreme abode. About this fact there is no doubt. At the final moment of death, whatever is then dwelled upon, unto that very state one goes, and is ever absorbed therein. Therefore, at all times constantly, think of me as you fight the war, with your mind always fixed on me. You shall certainly come to me. When dying, those with steadfast minds, devotion, strength, and yogic power, close every doorway to the world, and merge their minds into their hearts, uttering home the sacred word, while meditating upon me, leaving their bodies going forth, they reach the highest goal supreme, down from heaven's highest domains. All creatures do return reborn, but for those who have come to me, there can be no rebirth again. Unchanging and unmanifest, thus they call the ultimate goal, reaching which there is no return. That state is my supreme abode. There are two paths, one bright, one dark, thought eternal throughout the world. By one souls go without return, by the other they all come back. Yogis who clearly know these paths into delusion never fall. Therefore, Arjuna, always be steadfast in yoga constantly. And there we have an overview of Chapter 8, Akshara Brahma Yoga. It's had several names the chapter has. The most common name, I think, Akshara Brahma Yoga. And when we meet next week, we'll begin Chapter 9. Several announcements to make here. Tomorrow, Sunday, we have our twice-a-month satsang, question-answer time. If you have some questions, please come and join us tomorrow at 6 p.m. And this is a very different kind of announcement. I really would like some of you to be engaged in some of my video projects. I've been working actually for more than half a year now on a huge video project of taking the whole Bhagavad Gita and presenting it chanted by student actors in the role of Arjuna and Krishna. So two of my students have been trained in acting and are very nicely chanting this on a set, on a stage, and it's all being videoed and produced. We're coming towards the end of their work. Now we need to recruit two more student actors to take the role of Dhritarashtra and Sanjaya. Now, Dhritarashtra has the easiest job in the world. He has exactly one verse to recite, the very first verse. However, Dhritarashtra, so I want some of you to volunteer. Dhritarashtra should be of Indian origin, male, and older. So those are the requirements. And be able to chant one verse. Sanjaya has to chant several dozens of verses. So if you are comfortable chanting these Sanskrit verses, if you would like to participate in this project, if you are Indian and male, these are the requirements for the video, then I would like you to volunteer for this. We'll train you in terms of how to chant and all of that. But first we have to go through a selection process. So send me an email. Send me an email for both of those roles, and then we'll take it for there. Obviously, it has to be someone local. You'll have to attend several rehearsals. I would say two or three rehearsals, and probably 2 recording sessions. So you should be available to come here for those rehearsals and recording sessions. Also for these projects, I've been continuing to do quite a bit of video production, and it would be extremely helpful if 1 or 2 of you could volunteer as production assistants. And the assistance I require is very particular. You'll need to be adept at using Photoshop. So if you are a skillful user of Photoshop, and if you're willing to be a liaison with artists in India, there's a way to hire artistic talent in India, but I find it awkward to communicate. So the production assistant would have two tasks. One is to do Photoshop work for me. Those Photoshop artwork would then be incorporated into videos. And then the production assistant would also be a liaison with certain artists in India, all online, of course. Also, I'll mention that the production assistant need not be someone local. So it could be someone, literally anywhere. So it doesn't, if it's one of you here in the classroom, you'd like to volunteer, please volunteer. But if it's someone who's watching online and you want to volunteer in this way, send me an email. That would be very, very helpful. Okay, we can conclude our class with our brief prayers at the altar. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Good. Very good. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Avamahe Kaving Gavinamukam Ashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspataha Nashrinvan Hutabasira Sadhanam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururhatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramhanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhaveta Asato Ma Satgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya Om Shanti 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 Om Tat Sat Om